Picture Dallas, Texas, in the year 1930. The Great Depression has just swallowed the American economy whole. Banks are collapsing, farms are failing, men in suits are selling apples on street corners in cities that once glittered with promise. And somewhere in this wreckage, four men are sitting in a modest office, staring at a map covered in strange, squiggly lines, trying to convince oil companies to trust them with something almost nobody understood: sound waves. They had no idea, not the faintest inkling, that the company they were about to build would one day sit at the very heart of the electronics revolution, that it would help put men on the moon, that it would build the guidance systems for missiles, the calculators that ended the slide rule, and the very type of chip sitting inside the device you're using to watch this video right now. This is the story of Texas Instruments. And if you're the kind of person who loves a story where a boring, unglamorous beginning turns into something history-changing, you are going to want to stick around for this one. Before we dive in, if you enjoy these deep dives into the hidden origins of the technology we use every day, do me a favor and hit that like button. It genuinely helps this channel grow, and it costs you nothing but a click. And if you haven't already, consider subscribing, because we've got a lot more stories like this one coming. Now let's rewind the clock. Long before it was Texas Instruments, this company was called Geophysical Service Incorporated, GSI for short, and it wasn't founded by electronics geniuses or computer scientists. It was founded by geophysicists, men who understood rocks, sound, and the Earth itself. The technology they were selling was called reflection seismography. Here's the basic idea. You set off a small explosive charge underground, and the shockwave travels down through layers of rock. When it hits different geological formations, especially ones that might be hiding oil, the sound waves bounce back up to the surface at different speeds and angles. Sensitive instruments on the surface record these echoes, and from that data, geophysicists can build a rough map of what's hiding beneath the ground without ever having to drill a single exploratory well. Two of the key men behind this idea were Cecil Green and Eric Johnson, names you should remember because they're going to come up again and again in this story. Both were engineers with backgrounds in physics and geology, and both understood something crucial. The oil industry was tired of drilling blind. Every dry well cost a fortune. If you could reduce the guesswork even slightly, you could save oil companies staggering amounts of money. GSI's pitch worked. Oil companies across Texas and Oklahoma started hiring them to survey potential drilling sites. And here's the part that matters for our story. To do this seismic work well, GSI needed extremely sensitive, extremely precise electronic instruments, amplifiers, recording devices, custom-built equipment capable of detecting the faintest vibrations traveling up from thousands of feet underground. In other words, an oil services company was quietly becoming an electronics company. Nobody planned it that way. It just happened, one custom instrument at a time. Then came World War II, and like it did for so many American companies, the war reshaped GSI's entire trajectory. The US military needed sophisticated electronic equipment, submarine detection systems, communications gear, and other sensitive instrumentation. GSI's engineers, who had already spent a decade building precision seismic equipment, were a natural fit for defense contracting. The company's electronics division, called Laboratory and Manufacturing Division, took on military work, building submarine detection devices and other classified equipment for the Navy. This wartime pivot did two crucial things. First, it proved that GSI's engineers could build sophisticated electronics for purposes that had absolutely nothing to do with oil. Second, it gave the company a taste of a much bigger opportunity than seismic surveying ever could. Defense spending was pouring billions into electronics research, and the companies that positioned themselves at the frontier of that research stood to benefit enormously in the post-war world. By the time the war ended, Cecil Green, Eric Johnson, and their partners J. Clarence, Doc Karcher, and Eugene McDermott had a decision to make. Did they go back to being purely an oil services company? Or did they lean into this new identity as an electronics manufacturer? In 1951, they made their choice. The company reorganized, restructured its leadership, and gave itself a new name, one that would eventually become one of the most recognized brands in the history of technology. It's worth pausing here to appreciate how strange this must have looked at the time. Imagine a company built on finding oil deposits announcing that its future was in vacuum tubes and transistors. To outsiders, it probably looked like a company that had lost its way. In hindsight, it looks like one of the most prescient business pivots of the 20th century. If you're enjoying learning about how these unexpected turns shape the tech world we live in, drop a comment below and let me know. I read every single one, and it genuinely shapes what stories I decide to tell next. In the early 1950s, the transistor was still a laboratory curiosity. It had been invented in 1947 at Bell Labs by John Bardeen, Walter Brattain, and William Shockley, a discovery so important it would eventually earn all three men the Nobel Prize in Physics. But in the years immediately following its invention, almost nobody outside of a small circle of physicists and engineers understood what a transistor actually was, let alone what it might be used for. Texas Instruments saw something others didn't. The vacuum tubes that powered radios, calculators, and early computers at the time were bulky, fragile, power-hungry, and prone to burning out. A transistor, by contrast, was small, durable, and efficient. If you could manufacture transistors reliably and cheaply, you could shrink electronics down to sizes nobody had thought possible. In 1952, Texas Instruments made a bold move. It licensed transistor technology from Western Electric, the manufacturing arm of Bell Labs' parent company, for a mere $25,000. It was a modest investment for what would become an enormously consequential bet. 2 years later, in 1954, TI achieved something remarkable. It became the first company to mass-produce silicon transistors commercially. This might sound like a small technical detail, but it was a monumental leap. Most transistors at the time were made from germanium, which worked fine in mild conditions, but became unreliable at higher temperatures. Silicon, on the other hand, could handle much more heat and was far more abundant and eventually cheaper to produce. TI's engineer Gordon Teal led this breakthrough, and it set the stage for silicon to become the dominant material in electronics, a legacy so enduring that, decades later, an entire valley in California would be named after it. That same year, Texas Instruments did something that would put transistor technology directly into the hands and pockets of ordinary Americans. In partnership with a company called Industrial Development Engineering Associates, TI helped create the EE, the world's first commercially available transistor radio. It was small enough to fit in a shirt pocket, ran on a 9-volt battery, and cost about $50, a hefty sum at the time, roughly equivalent to several $100s today. The TR-1 wasn't just a gadget. It was proof, delivered directly into consumers' hands, that the transistor wasn't some obscure laboratory novelty. It was the future. Suddenly, people who had never heard the word transistor in their lives were carrying one around in their pocket, listening to music and news wherever they went. By the mid-1950s, this former oil survey company had transformed itself into one of the most important electronics manufacturers in America. But the story was about to take its most dramatic turn yet. If this kind of transformation story fascinates you, a company completely reinventing its identity and ending up somewhere nobody could have predicted, make sure you're subscribed, because there are more stories like this coming, and you won't want to miss them. Now we arrive at the heart of this story, the moment that truly changed the world. And it happened almost by accident, inside a nearly empty office building in the summer of 1958. Texas Instruments had recently hired a quiet, methodical engineer named Jack Kilby. Kilby had joined the company that May, which meant that as summer approached, he hadn't yet accumulated enough vacation time to take time off like most of his colleagues. So while nearly everyone else at TI's Dallas facility disappeared for their summer vacations, Kilby stayed behind, alone with his thoughts and a growing obsession with a problem that was quietly plaguing the entire electronics industry. The problem was known, somewhat dramatically, as the tyranny of numbers. Here's what that meant. As circuits grew more complex, engineers needed to connect more and more individual components, transistors, resistors, capacitors, with a tangle of wires, all soldered together by hand. Every connection was a potential point of failure. A circuit with 100 components needed hundreds of nearly perfect solder joints. A circuit with 1,000 components was almost unbuildable and definitely unreliable. As engineers dreamed up more ambitious electronics, they were running headlong into a wall imposed not by imagination, but by simple physical assembly. Kilby spent that quiet summer turning the problem over in his mind. And he arrived at an idea that seems obvious only in hindsight, the way the best ideas often do. What if you didn't build a circuit out of separate components wired together at all? What if you built the entire circuit, the transistors, the resistors, the capacitors, all of it, out of a single, unified piece of semiconductor material? At the time, this idea ran against conventional wisdom. Resistors and capacitors were made from different materials for good engineering reasons, and mixing everything into one component seemed impractical, maybe even impossible. But Kilby believed that if all the parts were made of the same semiconductor material, you could sacrifice a little bit of individual component performance in exchange for the enormous benefit of eliminating the wiring problem altogether. On September 12, 1958, Kilby demonstrated his idea to a small group of skeptical TI executives. His prototype wasn't elegant. It was a sliver of germanium, roughly the size of a paperclip, with wires sticking out of it at odd angles, held together with wax. It looked more like a science fair project than a piece of history-making technology. But when Kilby applied power to it, it worked. It generated a continuous sine wave on an oscilloscope, proving that a complete electronic circuit, oscillator and all, could function from a single piece of semiconductor material. That crude little sliver of germanium was the world's first working integrated circuit. What we now casually call a microchip, the tiny sliver of silicon inside every smartphone, laptop, car, and refrigerator on Earth, traces its lineage directly back to that quiet, half-empty office in Dallas, built by a man who technically only stayed behind because he hadn't earned enough vacation days yet. There's something almost poetic about that. One of the most important inventions in human history didn't come from a massive, coordinated research effort. It came from one determined engineer, alone with a problem, during a summer when almost nobody else was around to tell him it couldn't be done. If you're finding this as remarkable as I do, this is exactly the moment to hit that like button. Seriously, it takes 2 seconds, and it tells me you want more stories like this one. Here's a twist that makes this story even more interesting. Jack Kilby wasn't the only person working on this idea. Roughly 6 months after his demonstration, an engineer named Robert Noyce, working independently at a company called Fairchild Semiconductor in California, developed his own version of the integrated circuit, using silicon instead of germanium, and using a different manufacturing approach called the planar process. Noyce's version turned out to be significantly more practical for mass production. His planar process made it possible to create integrated circuits reliably, at scale, using techniques that could be repeated over and over with consistent results. This mattered enormously, because an invention that only works once in a laboratory is a curiosity. An invention that can be manufactured by the millions is a revolution. For years, Texas Instruments and Fairchild found themselves locked in overlapping patent disputes over who truly deserved credit for the integrated circuit. Eventually, the two companies reached a cross-licensing agreement, essentially agreeing that both Kilby and Noyce had made independent and essential contributions to the invention. History has generally been fair to both men. Kilby is credited with proving the concept could work, while Noyce is credited with figuring out how to make it manufacturable. Sadly, Robert Noyce passed away in 1990, which meant he was ineligible for the recognition that eventually followed, since the Nobel Prize is not awarded posthumously. But in 2000, Jack Kilby received the Nobel Prize in Physics for his invention of the integrated circuit, more than 4 decades after that lonely summer in Dallas. When he gave his Nobel lecture, Kilby was characteristically humble about it, treating the achievement less like a stroke of genius and more like the natural result of persistent, patient problem-solving. Once the integrated circuit existed, the world changed with astonishing speed, and Texas Instruments was standing right at the center of it. integrated circuits became essential to the US space program. NASA needed guidance computers that were small, light, and reliable enough to survive the extreme conditions of spaceflight. Traditional wired circuits with thousands of solder joints were far too heavy and far too failure-prone for a mission where there was no room for error. Integrated circuits, TI's invention among them, helped make the guidance systems of the Apollo program possible, quite literally helping put human beings on the surface of the moon. Military applications followed just as quickly. Guided missiles, radar systems, and eventually entire generations of defense electronics depended on the miniaturization that integrated circuits made possible. But Texas Instruments didn't stop at defense and aerospace. In 1967, TI engineers built the first handheld electronic calculator, a device that would eventually make the slide rule, a tool that had guided engineering and science for over 3 centuries, completely obsolete within a single generation. Then, in 1972, TI released the Datamath, one of the first mass-market pocket calculators sold directly to consumers, putting sophisticated computing power into the hands of students and professionals worldwide. By the 1970s and 80s, Texas Instruments had also become a major player in memory chips, digital signal processors, and educational technology, eventually becoming the company millions of students would come to know for one very specific reason: the TI-83 graphing calculator, a device so ubiquitous in American math classrooms that it became something of a cultural artifact in its own right, decades after its original release. Today, Texas Instruments has largely stepped back from consumer electronics and refocused itself on analog and embedded processing chips, the unglamorous but absolutely essential components that quietly run inside cars, industrial machinery, medical devices, and appliances all over the world. It's not a flashy business. You'll probably never see a TI logo on your smartphone. But somewhere inside the machinery of modern life, in a sensor or a power management chip you'll never notice, there's a very good chance a Texas Instruments component is quietly doing its job. What makes this story so captivating isn't just the invention itself, it's the improbable path that led there. A company that began by listening for echoes underground, hunting for oil in the depths of the Great Depression, ended up building the technology that underlies essentially every piece of modern electronics on the planet. Nobody at GSI in 1930 set out to invent the microchip. They set out to help oil companies stop drilling dry wells. But the precision instruments they needed to do that job pulled them, almost by gravity, into the world of electronics. The relationships they built, the manufacturing expertise they developed, and the culture of relentless engineering problem-solving they cultivated, all set the stage for a lone engineer to spend a quiet summer solving a problem that would reshape civilization. It's a powerful reminder that transformative innovation rarely follows a straight line. It usually comes from companies and people who are willing to follow the problem wherever it leads them, even if that means becoming something they never originally set out to be. So the next time you pick up your phone, start your car, or use pretty much any piece of modern technology, remember, somewhere in the deep evolutionary history of that device, there's a trail leading back to a handful of geophysicists in Dallas, Texas, who just wanted to find a little more oil in the ground. If you made it this far, thank you for coming along on this journey through one of the most unexpected origin stories in the history of technology. If you learned something new today, please take a moment to like this video. It really does make a difference in helping this content reach more people. Drop a comment and let me know which part of this story surprised you the most. I love reading your thoughts and often pick future topics based on what you're curious about. And if you haven't yet, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the next deep dive into the hidden histories behind the technology that shapes our everyday lives. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.